In this part of the video, I'm going to wrap up the topic of quantitative and qualitative research, and I'm going to wrap it up by talking about the three major differences between quantitative and qualitative research in general, and also by talking about the advantages and disadvantages of these two broad categories of research. So these are the three major differences that I wanted to highlight. First of all, the purpose of the research tends to be different. In a quantitative study, a researcher is trying to answer some type of specific research question. In other words, a researcher is trying to test some hypothesis. So in a quantitative study, a researcher might want to know if male college students tend to live on campus more than female college students. Or in psychology, a researcher might want to know if people who use social media tend to be lower in self-esteem. A researcher would do a quantitative study to answer that type of a question. In a qualitative study, a researcher isn't trying to answer one specific question. Instead, the researcher is trying to explore a topic and learn about that topic in as much detail as possible. So the researcher is trying to gather in-depth information about the topic that he or she is studying. So qualitative research is much more exploratory. It's more just throwing out a net and seeing what you find. And I think that quantitative and qualitative research work well as a cycle, because if a researcher does qualitative research first, the researcher will gather a lot of in-depth, interesting observations, and the researcher will understand the topic in a pretty detailed way, and then the researcher will be able to come up with hypotheses or questions that can be tested in a quantitative study. So imagine that I want to learn about students at a certain university. Well, I could start by going there and just observing them and seeing what I observe, maybe through naturalistic observation or participant observation. And when I do that, I'm likely to have new questions come to mind, like why is this behavior happening? Or why are they doing this behavior more than this behavior? And at that point, I can do a quantitative study and actually try to answer that specific question that I now have. So I think it does work well as a cycle of qualitative then quantitative. And the second major difference between these two types of research is the type of data that's collected. In a quantitative study, the researcher is recording data values or bits of information that are entered into a spreadsheet. So data values are either numbers like heights, ages, recall scores, or categories like male, female. That's the type of data that's recorded in a quantitative study, because those data values, those bits of information, can be entered into a spreadsheet and calculations can be performed with them. In a qualitative study, the researcher is gathering detailed, in-depth information, which might be sentences, it might be paragraphs of information. So yeah, in a qualitative study, the data that's gathered is detailed verbal information, such as what you might find in a notebook. So also, a third difference is the way that conclusions are reached. In a quantitative study, the conclusions are reached by running statistical tests. So in a quantitative study, you calculate statistics, and the statistics actually tell you what conclusion to reach. The calculations actually drive the conclusion. In a qualitative study, the conclusions depend on the subjective judgment of the researcher. In a qualitative study, a researcher looks through his or her notes and looks for themes and patterns that have emerged, and the researcher has to use his or her own judgment to decide what the important themes or patterns are. So in quantitative research, the conclusions are much more objective, it's just cut and dry, whereas in a qualitative study, there's more room for judgment. It's more subjective conclusions. Now, in a qualitative study, you're not allowed to just reach whatever conclusions you'd like to reach as a researcher. You can't just see what you want to see, but there is more room for subjective judgment when you reach conclusions. So now let's now talk about the main advantages and disadvantages of quantitative research in general. So in quantitative research, you get precise results in the form of numbers. The numbers are statistics. You get objective conclusions by carrying out statistical tests, and you're actually able to carry out statistical tests because you have the right type of data to do that. But the disadvantages, well, the main disadvantage of quantitative research is you get much less detailed information. In a quantitative study, a researcher is just collecting the data that he or she needs to answer the research question. The researcher isn't gathering any data beyond that. So the researcher might miss out on some interesting observations because the researcher is just trying so hard to answer one particular question. But now let's talk about the main advantages and disadvantages of qualitative. So in qualitative research, you get more detailed information because you can write down anything that's interesting. You're not just trying to answer one specific question. But the disadvantages are that your results are less precise because your results aren't numerical. Instead, your results are just a list of themes and patterns that have emerged. And you also have subjective conclusions which might cause bias to enter. The subjective judgment of the researcher could create some bias. And also, statistical tests can't be performed. So in a qualitative study, the data that's gathered isn't appropriate for running a statistical test. You can't just enter a bunch of paragraphs or sentences into a spreadsheet and run a statistical test. So in a qualitative study, the only way you can run a statistical test is if you code the data into categories, like 1 equals this, 2 equals this, and then put that data into a spreadsheet. But then the study actually becomes quantitative. So since you can't do statistical tests in a qualitative study, you can't be as objective and rigorous in your conclusions, because in a statistical test, you're actually able to say with a certain level of confidence that your observations are not just due to random chance. But in a qualitative study, you don't have any formal assurance that your results are anything other than chance. You can't say I'm 95% confident that my results are not due to chance. You can't do that in a qualitative study. So yeah, we talked about the pros and cons of quantitative as a whole and qualitative as a whole, and that wraps up this whole topic.